Okay. Gary Sturgess has a long and storied career, which I won't go into any detail. I find it really interesting that he was the head of the Serco Institute, doing thinking and application in the context of a large public service provider. But he has for many years been the Premier's Chair of Government at the Australian and New Zealand School of Government. The reason, and is one of the people who has operationalised and thought about the concept of commissioning, is really single-handedly responsible for introducing commissioning and contestability, which is now an official policy of the state government of New South Wales and is talked about and attempted to be practiced or begun to be practiced across Australia, and has a big impact on both Australian and UK public service thinking. More importantly, I think he combines real academic rigour, references, with some humour and some insight that goes all the way back to 18th century convict ships, but is really at the boundary, and this is exactly what the PSTA values, between the theory and the academic thinking, and some of it developing, some of it brand new, and real practice on the ground. So we're really pleased and privileged to have him here today, and back again on the 9th of November for a second day. Thank you very much. Over to you, Gary.
Thank you very much. If I can just, reiterate that, no doubt warming up a cold room takes a little time, but if there's points you'd like to, talk about, raise question as we go, then by all means speak up and make a point, ask a question, whatever. So we're going to look at a couple of things. Commissioning, and particularly today, an Australian contribution to commissioning. We've got a couple of sessions then on contracting. I have done less on contracting since I returned to Australia in 2011, but wrote a report earlier this year for the Business Services Association here, having warned them that their industry was not in a good place. And you might have noticed it hasn't got any better in the 18 months since I delivered their annual lecture. Wrote this report, which was published earlier this year, and it's brought me back again to contracting and to the discipline. But the commissioning work, as you'll see in a minute, is I spend my time much more working on public-to-public commissioning than public-to-private, not-for-profit. And then the last session of today, looking at contestability, which is a particular tool set within a commissioning framework that if you're going to devolve as a commissioner seriously, but it's one of the two things you need to think about in order to maintain control and accountability. So let me just begin by talking a little bit about why it is that it might be useful for you to hear something about an Australian contribution. I have done a lot of work on commissioning in Australia. I teach a commissioning academy in Canada. I have done for the last 4 years in Ontario, and we went to Ottawa for the first time this year as well. The New Zealanders have picked this up to some extent, although they've just had a change of government, so things will be in flux a little there. Why is it that, hopefully I can get this facing in the right direction, there we go. Why is it, why might Australia have something different to say about commissioning from the UK? And I think there are a couple of reasons. Firstly, Australia didn't go into recession, New Zealand did briefly, and in fact New Zealand's economy is doing better at the moment than Australia's, which means that there isn't that sort of focus on austerity that has intruded into this conversation or this development here. And therefore things look and feel a little different for that reason. Australia is a federation, and so it is the states that have traditionally delivered services. Local government in Australia is sort of rates and rubbish and roads. They have relatively small function responsibilities. Much of what would be done in the social welfare market in the UK is done by the states in Australia. not the transfer payments, that's done by the national government, but service delivery is done by the states. And historically, the states did that themselves. I mean, there was the same phenomenon of the 60s and 70s of the emergence of not-for-profits in the social care sector. That happened right across the English-speaking world. But an awful lot of these services that in the UK would be delivered by local government, by NHS trusts, local education authorities, that is done by the state governments. And that leads on to some things which we'll talk about in a minute. But also the states, because they have larger jurisdictions and larger responsibilities than the local government here, the states can actually design markets and manage markets. And so where here there's been a tendency, I've been sort of teaching when I come across twice a year at the Commissioning Academy since the pilots, when they was first being piloted. And one of the differences I noticed is here there was a tendency to talk about market engagement, and there's some very good work, and the session we're having next week, some terrific work on market engagement being done here. But there is market design and management done here at the centre. It's not done as consciously or as explicitly, or even I think probably as boldly as some of what we do in Australia, and that's partly, I think, because the states can run a hospital system that covers an awful lot of, quite a number of hospitals and a lot of space, to give that example. And then Labor in Australia has a tradition of using market instruments to reform public services. Now, a bit Blairite in some senses, except probably they embraced the tail end of that. And there were certainly a number of Brits who came across and were working in Prime Minister's office and left of centre think tanks, looking at more consciously at the use of market instruments. And again, next week we'll be talking about a national disability insurance scheme, which is a massive voucher market that we're in the process of designing and implementing, which was kicked off by our Labor government. Yes.
So in terms of market instruments, how broad a definition do you mean with market instruments?
Fairly broad. So again, I'll be doing this next week more fully, but so voucher markets, we have some sort of matching markets, stroke clearing houses. So this is sort of algorithm type work where you're designing systems to clear supply and demand through algorithms. So you see that with non-emergency patient transportation. Guy got a Nobel Prize. I'll talk a little in a minute about people with Nobel Prizes, but he sort of quite deserved this for the design of work around matching markets. And they've used that for matching medical students to hospitals and kidney matching. So these are non-price markets. So we do some of that. Some of these things are a bit more like a supply chain. I sort of have a big battle with public officials over this, because one of the dangers in using the M word is that economists immediately think you're talking about a commodity market, and a lot of these things, a lot of these instruments which have market-like qualities have got to be more consciously designed and managed than that. And and one of the things that you're sometimes dealing with is something that's a bit more like a corporate supply chain, but you'd like it to be contestable. You'd like some contestability in there so that it's not just simply a bunch of suppliers who are locked in forever. So there's a whole variety of different market-like instruments that are being used across Australia, and I'll touch on some of those in a presentation shortly. I forget exactly which one it is. So that leads to a number of things. Firstly, that because of the fact that there hasn't been the focus on austerity, there is this ability to focus on service quality as well as resource efficiency. Governments are still, as they always are, almost always are, under mild budgetary stress, but it's not severe, and so that makes the conversation quite different. It's not as intensively a conversation about cutting cost as has been going on here in a lot of government agencies. There is, I think, more time to get it right. Although I'm aware of some, I was up at Oxford with the Government Outcomes Lab on Friday, and there was a ring-in who was there who has been working with different government agencies who've got an engineering background and so sort of works in systems design, and he was actually giving me a couple of really interesting examples where people had negotiated space. But I think generally I have found that it's possible to negotiate with the politicians some space in order to get some design and to pilot some things. Not to say we always do that, and I'll talk a bit about some mistakes in that regard. Because so many services have been traditionally delivered by the state, we've still got a bigger exercise than here in devolving authority. So you have a mixed economy of delivery because of local government provision, because of NHS trusts and local education authorities. You have to think about the nature of that relationship. We're still doing an awful lot of devolution. You have parts of your system where I think, I'll talk a bit about prisons because and corrections over the next 2 days, because that's where I'm sort of doing the most advanced work, and there's some really, really interesting lessons to be learned out of what we're doing. Prisons is one area here where it's quite centrally controlled, and there has been a bit of a devolutionary move, and you could do more. There has been more experimentation with market stroke system, and I use both terms. System design is a bit of a broad concept, but the word market is sort of a bit narrow. It can lead people to assume that we're just talking about commodity markets. But there's more, I think, experimentation with that. We have a history of the states cooperating in the creation of national markets. So the states, while they constitutionally own a whole lot of these services, public services, the states have, in the last 20 years, cooperated a lot in sort of setting up national frameworks. So electricity, to take that example, which I won't particularly refer to again, is constitutionally a state responsibility, but the states came together and set up a national mechanism to create a national electricity market. Big country, Australia, so it took time. You had to build infrastructure to do it. But and then I think we've got more focus on public-to-public commissioning, in my experience. We spend proportionately more of our time talking about that sort of end of things than I guess I see here. Less, I think we have less focus on joined-up commissioning. I've been doing some work on the origins of commissioning here in the UK, and joined-up commissioning, the challenge of joining up is there right at the beginning, back in the mid-80s here in the UK, and here you are still trying to join up healthcare and social care 30 years later. It's a huge, hairy challenge, so it's not surprising that people are grappling with it. So that's not to say that we don't acknowledge the need to do it, and that it's not joining up either of supply or commissioning is not a proposition that people are aware of. There's just, I think, less work being done on that. There's a bit of it being done in the social care sector. Although just at the moment everyone's distracted by the National Disability Insurance Scheme, this big national voucher market, which I'll come back on mostly next week. Commissioning is not as strongly associated with outsourcing in Australia. Here I find it a bit conflicted. Some people have for a very long time got the fact that it is not necessarily associated with outsourcing, but there's still a strong weight that causes people to, here I find, go back and associate it with that. We do less exploration of alternative service models. I think that's one area where there's a lot we can learn from you. Not to say I think you've necessarily got it all perfect either, but there are, you do more of that. I think the social impact bonds, we are doing some. I think you've done more of that and more thoughtfully. public service mutuals, which I actually quite like and I think have or should have a significant place in the public service economy. We're doing much less of that, and so on. And then I think you are giving greater attention to we're probably paying greater attention to the governance of alternative models. I think one of the things that you haven't thought as much about as you probably should have, and I suspect we've got slightly better, is what governance mechanisms do you have for these things that you call a social enterprise? And I think Grenfell Tower is actually, when we get down to the governance questions, is a public entity that was wound up being owned by no one. And I think there's some interesting problems around that, and I think that's just one space we've probably got it a little better. We've got to work out which way I work these buttons. Let's just give me a minute. No, going the wrong way.
Sorry. That's entirely our fault.
Yeah, it's got a dial on it, which is not a button, so it's a bit new for me. So I apologise for the complexity of this, but I think it actually simplifies some of what I've been talking about. I think commissioning is essentially the interface. I think I have in the past, and I've come back lately, more comfortably referring to it as the missing discipline between policy and funding and delivery. I think this sort of function in the middle has been historically not appreciated. That's not to say that at different times we didn't do commissioning. Part of what we're doing, the Commissioner is doing, is clarifying outcomes. So there's sort of focus on outcome commissioning. We're pushing back at policy to say, well, what do you mean by that? And excuse me, but could you please prioritise that? Look, I think one of the things, because we in Australia are paying a lot more attention to this, I think the clarification of resources is a side where perhaps we're talking about that more explicitly than I'm seeing here. It's not only funding, because of the resources we give, one of the resources we give delivery people, the managers of delivery, is time, and Treasury isn't responsible for time particularly. But that conversation, that back and forward, that somebody to push back and to say on behalf of delivery, well, or to permit, to create a space where delivery is permitted to say, excuse me, but it's nice you want 26 outcomes, but did you realise you just gave me budget for 3? Or it's nice you want to reduce reoffending, but do you realise you haven't given me time to develop the systems where I could actually make an impact on that? And so that conversation is just as important as that one there. And that the greater focus on, if you like, the vertical handoff, which I think we're paying a bit more attention to in Australia because of our history, contributes to that. As I said, you're focusing more on, so there's this horizontal set of questions, the systemic ones, this joined up commissioning side. I think you've spent more time grappling with that. And as I said, in the NHS, it's been 30 years of trying to work out how do you better integrate the commissioning of social care and healthcare. I think we have, the other side of that is the design of the systems or the markets, in inverted commas, through which this the delivery side is structured, and I think we've probably been doing a bit more work on that, although there's been some good work done here. You've done, I think, more work on diversity in the delivery models. I think you've got more diversity, and there's lots we can still learn from you. I think we, again, because of our particular history, have done a bit more work on devolution and accountability. Some of that you didn't need to do, but I think there's some learnings like contestability that come out of this focus on devolution and the accountability back that you can benefit from. So I think there's some things that, because of different structures and slightly different histories, I think there's some stuff here that can be useful. Any comments, questions about that? Yes.
Just the market design stewardship point. I've recently been learned rather more about the NDIS, and I really wanted to know as part of a bid to renew New South Wales. And one of the things that struck me about is basically personalisation of disability services is what the purpose of the thing is. But one of the things that struck me was the lack of market stewardship within that process. That actually the equivalent policy in the UK is quite an explicit responsibility of local government and central government to ensure a functioning market, that people have choice and control over services. And that seemed, from what I read, to be entirely absent from the NDIS approach. And I was surprised.
Yeah.
It felt, it was puzzling. I was
Yeah. So I've got a whole session on that as a case study next week, in the session next week. The short answer is to say we have attempted to do a much more fundamental redesign than you've attempted here. It's not being executed terribly well for a number of different reasons. It's actually a great case study to look at the complexity involved in doing a big redesign, a big reinvent of your systems. So this is a movement from an old-fashioned grants-based scheme run by the states, where the treasuries had perfect control. You got $5 billion, and once $5 billion ran out, there wasn't any more. Not terribly fair to people with a disability, but perfect control to the national government taking it over to run a national scheme that is a voucher scheme. It's a individual budget scheme. A fundamental shift in the model, a huge redesign exercise that is hugely popular with people with the disabilities for which it was designed. It's stealing the oxygen from the room for people with mental health or people with cognitive impairment, and they're deeply concerned and unhappy, they and their spokespersons. But it is hugely popular. It is flawed. It has teething problems, which can and should be done better. I will also argue in that presentation it has more fundamental problems that were not thought through, and potentially, I mean, it's going to happen. It's going to go through because it's enormously popular and there is bipartisan political support for it. It's going to fail. In fact, my advice to the National Disability Insurance senior executive at one point was, there are two truisms here that you need to embrace. The first is, and these are not criticisms of you, the first is you don't know what you're doing, and secondly, you're going to fail repeatedly. And so you need to build those into the way you take this forward. It is an enormously complex task. It is the most ambitious exercise. Australia has lots of voucher markets. It's a model we've used repeatedly. We've never built anything this big this quickly, and it has flaws, and therefore it's a great learning tool. So been done consciously on a grand scale, and as a result, one of the results of that is that it has stuff missing.
Sorry.
Yes.
Just perhaps more a reflection than a question, but I'd be interested in your perspective around diversity and delivery. Sorry, my name is Emma. I'm a contract manager with an education charity. But my background is in public procurement in Sweden, where I'm from. And I find it fascinating in this country that there is so much diversity in delivery, just looking at the education sector, for example. And it adds so much complexity into the system, and I think also a barrier for social mobility. So I'd be interested in understanding what your view is, how it works in Australia in comparison to here, and how the diversity in delivery, there is a balance to strike, and how do you do that?
Yeah, and so when we get on to one of the two next presentations on contract, the third one, there is one of the trade-offs that you have to do is between certainty and innovation, or specification and innovation, and they are trade-offs. I agree that the ability of, well, I think both policymakers and service users to access and negotiate their way through a system is important. On the other hand, there has been a remarkable underinvestment in innovation in delivery across the English-speaking world. If I just sort of step back a minute and talk about public service mutuals, in spite of the fact that they sort of were driven, they were invented in the latter part of Labor's time, driven hard by Francis Maude, and there's been a bit of a flagging of interest, I think, since his departure. In spite of that, I think that the idea of a employee ownership in professional services makes a lot of sense. It is almost universal in the professional services part of the private sector. So if you think about law firms, consulting firms, accounting firms, they're called partnerships. They are employee ownership models. And if you look and ask the question, why would employee ownership be almost universal in professional services in the private sector and almost non-existent in the public sector, that leads you into a really interesting set of questions. And so I think an awful lot of what government does, particularly in the social care space, is professional services. And that absence, I think, arises from the fact that we did not give permission for sufficient diversity and experimentation around delivery models. But you've got a trade-off there. There's a tension between, if you have too much diversity, it becomes more difficult for people to negotiate those paths. Now, that has led to a blossoming, an expansion of mostly church-based schools or religiously based schools, but not exclusively, within Australia. And look, it's got its problems, and we could certainly do it better, but Australians are comfortable with that, and they negotiate that space quite well. I get your point, but I do think we have got to think about the fact that we probably haven't had enough, in my view, enough experimentation. But you do have to think, as you think about system design, in markets with a lot of complexity, or where you're buying a service that you don't fully understand how it's going to work, you tend to wind up with intermediaries who can then provide you as a parent or you as a purchaser with the information you need in order to make sense of this space. And that it may well be that part of the answer to that issue you raised, which is a valid one, is that there hasn't been enough time or enough thought put into the kind of intermediaries that would permit you to negotiate that space.